Hello, my name is Dwight Benedict. I'm Director of Student Life, and as a side hobby, outside of my job, I serve as the Winter Team Director. I am responsible for all of the winter games. Let me explain a little bit more about the organization and how it works. On the hearing level, we have an organization called the IOC, which is the International Olympics Committee. And for deaf people, there is a organization called CISS, the Committee International of Silent Sports. So the IOC and the CISS enjoy equal status. Both of these organizations are responsible for coordinating foreign countries together for the Olympics. And I will be specifically speaking of one country, clearly the United States. Let me explain one term I'll be using, the American Athletic Association for the Deaf. The American Athletic Association for the Deaf serves as an umbrella organization for all other sports organizations for deaf people, such as the Racquetball Organization, the American Ski Association, the American Hearing Impaired Hockey Association, the Speed Skating Association, the Volleyball Association, and so forth. All of these sports come under the AAAD. Also, the American Athletic Association for the Deaf has one side attachment to the World Games for the Deaf, whose main responsibility is setting up tryouts and organizing the teams from the United States in giving them training grounds and arranging for their travel to the countries where competitions will be held. Now, my specific role will be specifically geared toward the Winter Games, and I'll be working specifically on 5 sports that will be coming up for the World Games for the Deaf in Canada for 1991. The sports are the Alpine, which includes the downhill, the Super G, the giant slalom, and the slalom. A lot of people think that the Alpine only includes the downhill, but actually that's just one event out of 4 in the category of the Alpine sport. The next category would be Nordic. It is no longer called cross-country. That's an outdated term. We call it Nordic. And under that, there will be 3 or 4 events. And then the next category is speed skating. It's certainly no cakewalk on the ice. And then there's American hockey, but that will be taken care of by that particular association. And believe it or not, bowling, which is a new sport which has been added. And I'm not too crazy about this, but you have to work with what you have. So these are the kinds of responsibilities that have been taken up for setting up these games. And as director, it is my responsibility to coordinate all the tryouts for each of these categories. For example, in the Alpine category, through the United States Deaf Ski Association, which is a mother organization for the Alpine sport, which is responsible for the skiing on a worldwide basis, the United States bid to be host for the tryouts in Vail, Colorado. And so far, we have roughly about 50 to 70 registrants for the competition in Vail. And I have gone to Vail and had an opportunity to meet with the officials there to ensure that we have the correct selection procedure. For example, the hill that we need to use for our race has to be selected, and as you well know, there are several in Colorado. So we have to negotiate to have one of them closed so that we have a slope for our event. And it is quite a costly endeavor with the slope, which will easily cost as much as $4,800. There's no way for us to be negligent on this because we have to set a fence around the slope because it is somewhat dangerous. And so we've negotiated to close down the slope from top to bottom for that particular event. Then we also have to negotiate with the people in Vail for ordering of medals and ordering of bibs so that we can put the numbers on each of the contestants. Once that's been worked out, then we have to get all the paperwork in order for when people have to be at the slope. And they're extremely strict about this. Anyone who arrives after 9:05 will be automatically disqualified. It's a very emotional and serious thing, and anyone who arrives late, there is no excuse that we will accept because it throws off the fairness to the other contestants. So I have to set up the schedule, which will be from Sunday to Saturday night. For example, on Sunday evening, we will have registration for the race, and we also require that everyone attend an orientation so that we can familiarize them with the rules. For example, how to go through the gates, or if they're not going to go through the gates, how they're to go around them. And also, they have an opportunity to inspect the course. There are some who can go through the gates or around them to check the course. They're permitted to do that 2 or 3 times. Oftentimes, they're ready after that, but we don't permit that. We have to make sure that everyone understands as well as the next man. So we have the check going from 9 to 9:45, and then at 9:45, we begin timing what we call a form runner. And the form runners are just 2 outsiders who can be selected from anywhere and brought in to test the gate and the timing mechanism to ensure that everything is set. And then at 10 o'clock, we begin the actual competition. Everyone who goes down the slope will do so at 30-second intervals. So you always have people going down at 30-second intervals. The problem is that sometimes as you're ready for the next person, they're still trying to get their gear on, and that's one of the areas that tends to be most sensitive and making sure everyone's ready on time. If someone should slip and fall in the course, we have gatekeepers lined up down the slope so that they can radio and tell the people at the top to hold until the course can get cleaned up and the poles put back. So that will take us through Tuesday, and those are the 3 days required for the downhill, which comes under the category of speed skiing. And that has 4 events, and those 4 events are grouped in 2s. There's downhill and Super G. Again, those are called speed skiing, and then the other 2 clusters are the giant slalom and the slalom. And the latter 2 that I've mentioned are much more technical in nature, whereas the first 2 I mentioned typically are more gutsy. And for downhill, there is a 2-day minimum of training because of the risk involved, and it also gives us an opportunity to evaluate whether or not we feel someone may not really be qualified enough to do that. So after these 2 days of training, then on Wednesday, they get a 1-shot chance at going down the slope. There are no second chances. Once you're done, it's arrivederci, and you move on. On Thursday, on Wednesday night, we discuss the downhill, and then on Thursday we begin selection for each of the applicants. Everyone wants to be number 1, and there's a reason for that. When you get down to about the 20th person going down the slope, a rut forms, and people can slip and fall on it really easily. So people generally want to be within the first 10 or 20 to avoid that rut. And a good question might be how it is we go through the selection process. What we do is look at the points that they've earned for a year under the USSCA, which is the United States Commission on Skiing, who have the regulation measurements and the different levels of competitions. And also we look at individuals who have been involved in deaf competitions and tournaments. And then based on all that information, we pick the top 10 individuals who are the top seeds, and then you start going down in terms of 10s by 2nd and 3rd and 4th clusters. Then we begin to draw numbers for each of the individuals and begin assigning the numbers 1 through 10 on their bibs. Then on Thursday, we begin the competition for Super G. Super G, incidentally, is a fairly newcomer to this. It used to be only downhill, giant slalom, and slalom. And they wanted to add something that was not only quick, but also involved some technical maneuvers, and that's the kind of thing that was involved. Some people think it may supplant downhill. I'm not sure that that's true, but it certainly has gained a great deal more popularity. Most people are doing giant slalom, slalom, and Super G. There are few who are getting involved in downhill. So anyway, we have this Super G competition, and then on Friday we do the giant slalom. The Super G, giant slalom, and slalom are permitted 2 runs per person. Lets them go down once, rest, and then we reset up the course, get the poles put back up, and then everyone goes down. And then we then change the course. And then of the 2 times, we look for the best. And you go from 1 down to whichever the last person is. And interestingly enough, what you do is the person who did the best on the first run will be the last to go on the second run. You have to change everything around. And that way it keeps everything fair for all of the individuals. And the winner is the one who gets the best overall score. It's also nice because if someone doesn't do well on their first run, say they fall or slip, they can always depend or at least have a second run to depend on. So that takes us through Super G, the giant slalom, and the slalom, which is very technical and actually is quite a lot of work for the gatekeepers who have to be pretty closely lined up down the slope because the poles generally are only 10 feet apart from each other, and as individuals go down them, they of course, get knocked off, and the gatekeepers have to go and put them back. It's not like downhill where the poles are set up so far from each other and staggered so far away that they don't have as much trouble doing that. I think I've covered most of the sports that are involved in the Alpine. As I said, that has pretty well been worked out with Vail, and everything is set for March 11th. So that moves us on to the Nordic, which is much more difficult to organize because there are so few participants in that sport. Just last week I was in Vermont, and I think it was just 4 women and 2 men. And I understand that that's the kind of statistics they have with hearing people too. It seems to be much more popular in Europe. So instead of having just a tryout to get people to come in, we usually have tryouts going on an ongoing basis so that we can pull a team together as we find individuals. So far, we have identified 4 outstanding men and women. We're hoping to find 2 more women, possibly 3, so that we can set up a relay team for the cross country. And that's the current situation there. The next category then would be the American hockey. And as I said, we'll leave that responsibility to the organization themselves, which is the American Hearing Impaired Hockey Association. They will be responsible for doing everything from beginning to end in terms of fundraising and team selection. Of course, they will be working in concert with 2 members from the World Games for the Deaf when they begin selecting their team, and they'll be going from there. Most of the hockey players typically come from Chicago because that's where the home organization is. So we try to be fair to everyone in this. The next category is speed skating, and though we have searched diligently, we have only found 1 person, but it's good news. When I compared this guy's time, he had beat the Norwegian time. When I'm speaking of Norway, I'm speaking of the World Games for the Deaf held in Norway. They took first in every event under speed skating, and I found this guy who's beating them, and I didn't believe it at first, so I asked him to send me the sanctioned time, the official time, and sure enough, it held true. So I don't want to get too excited, but I'm very hopeful, and we'll be taking him with his team, and hopefully he will be sweeping a bunch of medals for us. Let's see, that brings me then to bowling. What can you say about bowling? I've always thought of it as being kind of a summer sport, but CIS has voted to have bowling included as a sport in 1995, but CISS asked Canada if they would go ahead and accept the resolution earlier for this year to put bowling in for 1991. I'm not as happy, and I'm not very comfortable with that. But currently, Canada is not very pleased with that decision because they don't want to take responsibility for that. There's no way to set up a tryout or really a selection process. So next week in February, we'll find out whether or not this is going to go or not. If it does, then what will happen is that they'll just have to contact the National Bowling Association, and they'll have to pull a team themselves. And then we're also responsible for getting parade equipment, parade clothing, the equipment, plane tickets, and everything. We have to raise about $250,000 to accomplish this in order to get to the World Games for the Deaf. And I hope